So good afternoon, and welcome to another installment of Between the Pillars, our podcast series that we do bi-weekly at the Fisher Library. My name is John Shoesmith, and I'm the outreach librarian at the Fisher. And again, I say at the Fisher, even though I'm not at the Fisher, neither is Holly at the Fisher. We decided to do one more episode, or probably next few episodes remotely, because we're only allowed 3 people at the library at one time. There's already 3 people at the library today. So in the interests of our health and safety, we're going to do this remotely. We'll probably do the next couple remotely, but hopefully, fingers crossed, with the vaccine program on the way and more people getting shots, we will hopefully be opening our library in the next few months. So I would encourage you actually just to keep checking up our website and our social media to see when we do reopen. So I want to introduce Holly Forsyth Paul. She is Holly's been working at the Fisher now for a number of years, and we're going to be highlighting really one of the most treasured collections at the Fisher Library. It's one of the, what I classify one of our Tier A collections. It's the Joseph Brabant collection of Alice in Wonderland. And it's you'll learn more about it as Holly and I go through. And we're titling this episode "Going Down the Rabbit Hole with the Joseph Brabant Alice Collection." So welcome, Holly. Holly is the Hillary Nichols Fellow at the Fisher Library, but you didn't start as a fellow. I think you started as a GSLA at Fisher. Is that right?
Yeah, I had in a book history course as a project, I had made a finding aid for Joe Brabant's correspondence and records related to his collecting. And so when the Fisher had a position for a graduate student to process the Brabant collection, that helped. I had already been sort of working on Brabant's records when it came time to do some cataloging.
Okay, and then you became the Hillary Nichols Fellow. When was that? That was.
I worked at the Fisher for about a year as a GSLA, and then so I started in April of 2017, and then in September of 2018, I became the Hillary Nichols Fellow. And that's when I started working on other collections as well. I also work on the short title catalog collection and the Thomas Hardy.
Yeah. Alice, though, is something that you have familiarity with. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your background before you came to Fisher.
Yeah, Alice has been really good to me for a long time. Before I came to the Fisher and came to the Faculty of Information, I worked at U of T for a little over 10 years teaching English literature. And one of my specialties was children's literature. I'm a Victorianist. I also taught Kitty Lit, they call it, at all 3 campuses. And it's a great course. It's always packed and it has a really diverse student interests. You meet all kinds of students there. And so I always taught out.
Did you know much about the Fisher's Alice collection at that time?
I didn't know as much as I do now. I was aware of it when I was working on my doctorate. The exhibition took place, and I remember the banner on the outside of the building of a really long Alice. And I had been to the Fisher a handful of times, but I hadn't worked with the Brabant collection at all before I came as an high school student.
That might be a good launching point actually to talk about what we're going to talk about, which is mostly illustration. Is talk about Brabant.
Yeah.
So why don't you share your screen with us? Because I think you have a photo of Joseph.
I do.
There we go.
Yeah. So this is.
What can you tell us about Joe Brabant?
He was originally he grew up in Saskatchewan, but after he went to McGill, he lived much of his adult life in Montreal. And he was a lawyer, very successful lawyer for the Sun Life Corporation. And his work involved a lot of travel. And so he took up an interest in collecting Alice exclusively, Lewis Carroll only, in the 60s. And as he traveled around the world, he would comb through bookstores, and he sort of left sort of a standing order with many book writers or booksellers every morning he spent like a half an hour at least writing letters to different booksellers, contacting them to let him know if they had anything Carol related. He was early member of the Lewis Carroll Society in the UK and a founding member of the Lewis Carroll Society in North America. And he, even though his background was not at all in critical studies or English lit or um, anything like that, he was a lawyer. He developed a real deep, broad scholarship in Caroliana, and so he was very reticent about appearing in print, um, and only did so rarely. But he advised a lot of scholars on Lewis Carroll, and his opinion on, differences between editions. There are all kinds of letters in his correspondence where he's noticed punctuation marks.
Wow.
That are in a different place that, most scholars would not be able to keep track of. So he was really knowledgeable.
Do you know if there's anything particular about the Alice story that appealed to him that made him want to collect in this area?
I don't. I know he really identified with the Mad Hatter character. And, there certainly was a lovely sense of community in those early Carol Society meetings. Everybody would dress up for their annual dinner. So there's a lot of whimsy in it.
Right.
There is certainly a lot of sort of Anglophile celebration of Oxford, that sort of thing, because Lewis Carroll, of course, was a math professor at Oxford. And so there's, but I don't know what it was in particular that appealed to him, because he was unusually, for a collector, really focused on a single subject, but really a completist. Like there was nothing that he wouldn't collect.
But what a great collection. Maybe we could start then looking at some of the treasures within that, some of the treasured illustrated editions that we have.
Yeah. So
actually, can you tell us how large the collection is?
Yeah, there's about 10,000 items, from what I understand. I've cataloged 3,000 books.
Wow.
And there, had been much of the treasure had already been cataloged long before I started, 20 years before I started. Right. So there's a lot on the shelves. There are still some items of ephemera, booksellers' catalogs, things like that aren't cataloged. But most of those we've kind of been able to log in the finding aid of Joe's correspondence. Right. But there's also there's some photographs that Lewis Carroll took. There's a letter, or there's several letters from him. But there's one to his illustrator for Sylvie and Bruno that has drawn instructions that the illustrator then ignored. And so, there are some really amazing, unique items, archival items as well. And there's even some realia. So there are some tea sets and
soap, I think.
Yeah, dishes, some things that aren't, that we can't keep with the books. Yeah.
Well, this is a good start, obviously, to talk about Tenniel.
Yeah, so everybody knows about this illustrator. This is the original illustrator, John Tenniel. He was a cartoonist from Punch and very much an establishment figure. So he worked really closely with Carroll, who had, of course, originally made a full manuscript for Alice Pleasance Little that had Carroll's own drawings. Right. And so there's quite a bit of sort of micromanaging in their process, that Carroll just wanted Tenniel to recreate his own illustrations with his own staging, but at a professional quality. So a different model is used. So, and Carroll's original Alice was dark-haired, so they've used a different little girl for their pictures. But all of the positioning is the same. But there was some pushback too, as much as Carroll controlled Tenniel, when the first printing of Alice was made by Macmillan. This image on the right, the Appleton edition, Tenniel took a look at the proofs and rejected this edition, and you can see the approved first edition Macmillan on the left hand side, and the in the picture you can see what Tenniel objected to, that a lot of the detail in his illustration gets lost because there were problems with the ink in this first edition. So the whole thing had been printed at Carroll's expense, and he was sort of at a loss for all of these copies. So he eventually sold them to Appleton, was a New York publisher, so that he could get back some of the money he'd lost.
Right.
And so they are extremely sought after by collectors, the kind of collector who wants, the stamp that has the airplane printed upside down is very much drawn to the Appleton. The mistake becomes the thing of value.
Right.
And the other big problem with the Appleton edition is in this slide, where you can see that there's some bleed through. So while you're looking at the illustration, you can see the print from the other side of the page has come through. And in some copies, it's worse than in others. But it's a constant in the Appleton editions of this problem.
It's amazing that an illustrator would have sort of that much sway over a publication like this.
Yeah, I think, Carroll took advice. He wasn't a professional writer, and Tenniel was very much a professional illustrator. And as the original Macmillan edition, which is actually a second edition, even though it's officially the first issue from Macmillan, is the better for it. It's rare to see such a beautifully printed first edition,
right?
Or beautifully printed cheap edition of a book. Yeah. So this became really iconic. It was the only version of Alice that was published during Carroll's lifetime, which lasted almost to the end of the century. And it wasn't until 1907 that the text for Alice came out of copyright so that other illustrators could take a run at it. But it does seem to be the sort of book that everybody wants to take a run at because it's so iconic.
Whenever I do tours and I talk about our Alice collection, I always talk about sort of the luck perhaps of it falling out of copyright so early, because it is a story that's ripe for illustration. And what illustrator wouldn't want to get their hands on this type of text?
Yeah, the descriptions are really rich. They're lots of fun. And there's so many animal characters to draw. This is Harry Roundtree. So this is one of the early versions of Alice that came out as soon as the copyright was withdrawn. And so Roundtree was a specialist in drawing animals. And so he actually goes beyond the prescribed pictures that Carroll had Tenniel draw. He had freedom to pick and choose what he wanted to draw. So whereas most illustrators really stick to the staging and subject matter of the original, Roundtree really has fun, and he has like profuse illustrations. Almost every page has at least a little miniature, and he picks up on characters that are not drawn in most versions of Alice. So he's great fun. So this is a book that's mass produced by a professional illustrator for a child market, and it's got a really nice soft watercolor palette, but there's a lot to take in, and he leaves very few things undrawn. So it's a really fun edition. It's the early part of the 20th century. Around the same time, we get Arthur Rackham.
People will be very familiar with probably these ones.
Yeah, so he's a really famous turn of the century Art Nouveau illustrator, really well known for his fairy tale illustrations. And this Alice, I think, is famous because she's so different. Dark hair, this is a real soft pastel palette. And given that the characters are based around playing cards, you expect a primary palette. And so to see all of those really muted tones of browns and pinks is a surprise. It's still really unusual in the sort of canon of Alice. You can see the plates where the illustrations are printed lift up a little bit from the brown paper behind them, and they've been pasted in, because in order to maintain the softness of the images, Rackham used an early photographic printing process on glazed paper, because softness is definitely the goal with these, so both in line and in hues of color that he's using. And so he produced these through like photogravure, I believe it's called. And it's a really sort of early photographic process.
And this is definitely not mass produced.
No, there are only 11,030 copies of this.
Right.
So it's a real deluxe limited edition. So this is an illustrator who really understands what appeals to children, but I don't think you'd let a child handle this big, beautiful book. It's really quite large.
Right.
And it's on handmade paper. It's deluxe because it was so expensive to use this production method for the illustrations. They had to, upmarket the whole thing. But I wanted to include the
His version's a
details.
little bleak, isn't it?
Yeah, the landscape is just awful. Carol tends to describe the characters in great details and maybe the props, but he rarely describes the landscape of Wonderland. And yet few people play with that very much, and yet Rackham makes it a wasteland. And it's quite shocking when you think of how soft that Alice is, that he would go so dark, so edgy with his imagery. And the rabbit, I think, is quite terrifying. The rabbit to me looks like a praying mantis. Is not a pretty rabbit. So but this is consistent with what Rackham does in his fairy tale illustrations. Fairy tales are edgy and dark at the same time that they fully belong in the nursery. And Rackham doesn't forget that. He doesn't soften things too much. Ree Kramer, on the other hand, has been accused of, softening things too much. She fell out of fashion because of her sort of cheerful optimism that her Alice matches the flamingo. It's a beautiful pink Alice with great sunny colors. This again is a real children's edition, like the Harry Roundtree. It's not an expensive book, published in the 30s. So quite a few black and white plates as well as the full color.
She herself has an interesting story, doesn't she? She's a fairly interesting woman.
Yeah, so she was a Dutch artist. She, in addition to illustrating, she also did theater costumes, and she wrote plays. And she was very outspoken against the Nazis, and so she was blacklisted during the war for speaking out against the Nazis. And this is in the Netherlands. And so she spent much of the war working with the resistance. She helped hide Jews. She helped refugees get out of the country. And she wrote several poems that actually were, you wouldn't think a poem would be a really powerful form of resistance, that these things were repeated as a form of solidarity and actually were quite outrageous, like provoking to the Nazis who were running the regime in the Netherlands. And so she was quite courageous. So I think that kind of makes you look at that optimism in her drawing here and after the war in a different way. That it seems to be a much more sort of defiant way of looking at the world as somebody who really does know darkness.
Are you also starting to see some differences now that some women illustrators are taking the story?
Yeah, I think it's important to try to find women in book history. Sometimes they're really hard to find because they're they can be cataloged under their husband's surnames. Their names disappear, and it just depends on the conditions under which they published. So because the Alice illustrators tend to be 20th century, they're easier to locate. You can find women consistently. And children's lit, because it tends to be a dismissed area in publishing very often. I mean, both because there's just so much. Children destroy books, so you have to keep making them and to replace them. And, you know, a child grows up and then you have to, you know, crank out some more material for the next kids who are being born behind them.
Right.
So it's such a prolific area of publishing that there's room for women to find a career there. And I think there is an understanding that women may have an insight um, with a lot to offer where children are concerned because they spend more time with them most of the time. So yeah, I think the psychology of Ree Kramer's Alice is quite interesting too. This is Mervyn Peake. He's most famous for writing Gormenghast, the Gormenghast trilogy. And as you can see, he was a really sensitive artist as well. These are beautiful pen and ink drawings. So now we're just after the war. Ree Kramer's Alice is before the war. And here the Alice is quite elfin in a lot of ways. She's extremely expressive. There's no color in this edition. They're all pen and ink drawings. And it's a really cheap edition on really quite terrible post-war paper. So for collectors, this is a really, you know, prize thing to find a Mervyn Peake first edition Alice that's in good shape. And our Mervyn Peake is quite lovely. It's in great condition. But he again, and I think like Rackham, has that combination of really understanding sort of whimsy and a childlike approach to the world, and at the same time keeping that really dark edge because that Cheshire cat is scary. There's a sense of the monstrous there.
Right.
And he really captures the spirit of the story. Graham Greene thought that Mervyn Peake had done the best illustrations for Alice. So hard to argue. This is Leonard Weisgaard. He is an American illustrator, did a lot of golden books, did a lot of work with Margaret Wise Brown, who famously wrote Goodnight Moon, among other things. And with Margaret Wise Brown, he did a book called The Noisy Book. And Weisgaard's interesting because he's clearly referencing things like Russian constructivism and surrealism and cubism and bringing it into children's books. And so he's recently started to become fashionable again. Collectors are starting to notice his work.
Right.
And it's quite lovely because it's a mass marketed book for children. And yet there's a real level of sophistication there that, you know, a lot of the time these children have an adult behind them reading. And so it's really nice if there's something there for both levels, you know, that you have all the color and appeal and literalness that a child needs to connect the story with what they're hearing if it's being read to them. And yet you have some sophistication there for the parent who's probably got to read that book over and over again.
Well, I was going to say the parent has probably grown up with the story at the same time.
Yeah. And so to see it done in a fresh way is really, it's nice. So Weisgaard's really influential as far as like being able to interpret 20th century, sort of mid-century art and bring it into a children's book context. He's really influential in new ways of bringing cityscapes into children's books. And he mentored Morris Sendak.
Oh.
So I think he might become more collectible than he has been. So it's nice that we've got a really good copy.
Great.
Yeah. This is Ralph Steadman, and he is best known for being the illustrator of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, working with Hunter S. Thompson. And he did a lot of satirical caricature work, cartoon work, and sort of famous for making dogs based on ink blots. So likes to experiment, big sense of humor. Don't think this is an Alice for children, in part because it's, again, another really deluxe book, but also because he's kind of terrifying. There's some cleverness with the idea of the book as object that's really here demonstrated in these pictures. He's really playing with the gutter between the two pages. So I've tried to include pictures of Alice in the rabbit's house wherever I could find them for some consistency to compare these illustrators. And I think this is a really good one because Alice, the more you close the book, the more she is being constrained by the rabbit's house with her foot up against the wall, kind of like the trash compactor in Star Wars. And the second image on the right also really plays with the gutter of the book. There's an optical illusion with the tree that's growing in the middle of the tea table. And the way he has drawn shadows in the tablecloth. Again, there's a detail here that you can kind of see what happens where the page folds and the tree sort of blends in. It really looks like the tree is sort of impaling the book. That's probably the least terrifying thing about that picture. So the tea party, they're drinking from a coffee percolator, and the Mad Hatter looks like he's from like a Pink Floyd movie.
You can really tell the era too that this was made.
Yeah, you really can. So, even though they're wearing bowlers, it's more of a Clockwork Orange kind of bowler than it is a businessman or a Magritte. And, there's definitely these are very mad characters, but there's something really menacing about this Alice. So, yeah, not for children.
And it's not disrespectful either, I don't think, in the same way.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, this one is a not for children deluxe edition,
but quite a famous one at that.
Yeah, I think we're really fond of showing this one when visitors come because it's a really impressive object. This book, it's big, and it's unbound, and it's on beautiful handmade paper. Editor at Random House commissioned Salvador Dali to illustrate Alice in a small exclusive edition for the Book of the Month Club.
And you said the perfect match, and maybe explain that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, Carol is not just a nonsense artist, but he is a surrealist, in part because he was a math professor. A lot of Alice is structured on logic, and so there's a great deal of sort of play with different forms of illogic in the way that Alice is structured, and a lot of sort of game theory in the way that Alice operates. And you have the same sort of thing going on with mid-century surrealism, the kind championed by Dali, where you have recognizable elements, representational elements that are flipped on their head. And so Dali comes from Carol in many ways. That sensibility is a really shared thing. And yet there's, again, a kind of a struggle in this one. I think Dali, he has melting clocks throughout the book, sort of, referring to his own branding in the persistence of memory. And the most enduring or constant image is the landscape with a girl with skipping rope, or landscape with girl skipping rope, appears on every page. So you can see it above the caterpillar on the left, in the lower right purple area of the center image, then featured in the page that opens the book, which I'm not, nobody knows exactly what's in any of these pictures, but it seems to be almost like a Alice looking at herself, like the dreamer and the dream in the same image. And there's a wonderful sense that, a woman sort of running with her arms in the air turns into a girl skipping rope, that, terror or madness and play are never that far apart from each other in that image. There's a kind of, for me, a little too on the nose play with Carol's caterpillar, which is obviously a symbol of transformation in this story of a girl who's just at the edge of puberty, wondering about, change and her body and working through social norms. The caterpillar is an advisory figure in Alice's journey. And Dali comes right out and has it as the butterfly again and again, in several illustrations. And I don't think we need it that literal, but it's there.
For the surrealist, he's very literal.
So I have a few more images of the Dali just to show the girl with skipping rope becomes an ornament on the initials of every chapter, and then the cover and the presentation of this edition is really spectacular.
Leave it d'autiste because it's not bound either.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, and it's you know, on a hand-turned press with special inks, using heliogravure, which is a kind of photographic etching to make these colorful images. There were only 2,700 copies of this edition printed, and they were all signed by Dali. Some more valuable copies were signed on every illustration, and some were just signed in one place. The first edition now sells for around $15,000, and but you can buy your own copy on Amazon. Since 2015, Princeton came out with a reprint, so now people can actually look at their own copy at their leisure. Right. But I still recommend they come to the Fisher to see the real thing. It's magnificent to see such an impressive book.
And if you're ever on a tour with me, I'll probably bring this book out because I bring it out a lot.
It's very reliable of you.
Yes.
This is sort of back to a woman illustrator. This is Tove Jansson. She's a Swedish Finn, so she grew up speaking Swedish, but she's from Finland. So there's an outsider sensibility about most of her work. She's most famous, sort of iconic in Finland, for writing Finn family Moomin Troll, and creating a whole Moomin Troll universe. And in some of her creatures and the shapes of buildings in her Alice, you see that she's actually made Wonderland an extension of Moominland. There's a lot of overlap between those two universes. So she's whimsical and gentle, very soft palette again. But still there's a little shiver of fear, like in the Moomin Troll world, she's dealing with goblins and trolls and sort of domesticating them, but they're still goblins and trolls. And you have that, I think you see it best in her Cheshire Cat, where it's not as scary as the Mervyn Peake Cheshire Cat, but that's still a cat with a bit of an edge. And you know, I don't think that, you know, you get the full thrill of a fantasy world without that little taste of danger. It's a really consistent thing. There aren't too many tame worlds that, you know, come in popular books. You have to have a little bit of spice. So Tove Jansson is another really impressive figure, an outspoken anti-fascist, somebody who was quite courageous in being an out-of-the-closet lesbian when that was a difficult thing to do. And somebody who really understood what it was like to be an outsider, sort of being in a linguistic minority,
right?
And sort of being very progressive, reassuring figure. Her books are really quite lovely, and her Alice is really consistent with that oeuvre, which is nice. And so one thing I thought was really interesting in going through these different Alices is to see how different illustrators deal with Alice's body image, which is an issue in the book. Alice keeps shrinking and growing in a really troubling way, and that makes it difficult to navigate the world. And that's a poignant theme for a girl who's approaching puberty. And in Tenniel's hands, famously, we just have the stretching neck, because what else can you do? She's Victorian. And you can only show so much. But I think it's to see what the different choices that different illustrators make. One thing that's really nice about having a single subject collection that's so encyclopedic is that you can see all the different tacks that people take in order to, you know, deal with that subject matter. And so we have, you know, Tove Jansson going right for the waist,
Mm-hmm.
which is definitely an issue in puberty.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, illustrating things that Tenniel missed, she puts the lanterns back that Carol described in this tunnel at the beginning of Alice's entry to Wonderland. And then Roundtree's Alice, she's Edwardian, so it's the drop waist dress with the black legs, and so it's the legs that grow uncontrollably, and with a really remarkable shadow in behind. That's quite beautifully done.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ralph Steadman's terrifying Alice, who really kind of looks like an old man,
Mm-hmm.
with long hair. And this is Alice during her fall. So it's just kind of interesting. You have neat opportunities for comparison
Yeah.
in a big collection like
Yeah.
this.
Oh, George Walker.
George Walker. So here's our sort of great um, illustrator engraver in Toronto, who did a really quite magnificent edition of Alice with Joe Brabant himself, and Bill Poole. The three of them together made the Cheshire Cat Press and produced this Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1988. And it's a beautifully made um, specimen of a book on gorgeous handmade paper with profuse wood engravings in all kinds of colors, and again a really in a small batch. So it's a really fine example of the print arts, and it's really quite lovely knowing that we can produce things like that here.
George comes back to this subject quite often as well. I mean, he still has the Cheshire Cat Press as well. So
Yeah.
and I should mention that George actually donates his wood engravings to the Fishers, although we don't have his Alice. I'm gonna have to talk to him about that.
We have his wonderful hunting of the Snark that he produced. I think was the year before last, with the Trump and his cabinet as the characters, and it is
amazing.
Shocking. It's so good, but it's really, there's a lot of anger in those engravings. It's a magnificent thing to see. And again, the quality is unbelievable in his work. It's so beautifully done.
So I mean, to me you've only touched. It's like the tip of the iceberg in terms of of the illustrators that you've shown here. I mean, how many more do you think could you have gone with?
How much time do you have?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Because
there's so
the
much.
the collection. It points to the richness of the collection.
Yeah, I mean, there's 10,000 books, and there's every possible Macmillan that edition or issue that Joe could possibly get his hands on. So for somebody who's studying, printing history, or for somebody who's interested in book bindings, commercial bindings, somebody who's interested in illustrations, this collection really has it all because it's got such completeness and such breadth. If you wanted to look at shape books, miniature books, oversized books, pop-up books, there's really everything in this collection.
Books in translation.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So many books in translation. It's really, really incredible. And also you can look at, the history of book ownership. We've got some beautiful copies that were signed by Carol himself. He always signed things in purple ink. And we've got some books signed by Tenniel himself. We have a wonderful first edition of Through the Looking Glass that Tenniel drew a doodle of the Mad Hatter in. So there's all kinds of ways into this collection. They're also, one of my favorite things about this collection is that many of these books were owned by children. And so you see signatures, little dedications, Christmas presents. There's one early 20th century book that has a letter to Santa in it from what's obviously a very small child. And she's offering to give the book back so that she can give something to her dad for Christmas. Like there's, and all kinds of different people of note have owned copies of Alice that have ended up with us, like the pioneer of forestry as a scientific discipline.
Right.
Owned a copy of Allison. We've got it.
Yeah.
So all kinds of treasure.
It tells us a bit too about the story of a book collector at the same time, I think.
Yeah.
So when you have
And
such a complete, when you have such a complete and thorough collection.
yeah, and pre-internet largely.
Yes.
So this is a collection that's based on correspondence. So there's an opportunity here for somebody who wants to understand the afterlife of books
Right.
and how books circulate. That there's a paper trail in this case because this is a collector who's active primarily from 1967 to 1997.
Right.
And so we can see him adapting to technological change, but he is really working one-on-one, at least in correspondence, and very often on foot abroad,
Right.
and letting it be known that he wants anything that people have, and contacting people who have books in production so that he can get a copy. You can really see how book collecting worked and in many ways still does work.
Yeah.
With really full, complete documentation,
Yeah.
which I think is going to become more of an issue now that everything is virtual.
Exactly. This has been great, Holly. Thank you for all the work you've been doing with the Alice material, because I think it's, as I said, it's probably one of the most important collections we have at the Fisher.
It's been a joy.
And I would encourage anybody when we do reopen that these books are publicly accessible. You just come to the library, look into our catalog, order them, and you can go look. You can look at the Dali version in our reading room for as long as you want to look at it. So it's. I always like to remind people that these are books are accessible to the public. So thanks, Holly.
Oh, my pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be looking at what we call adventures in the backlog. So I'm not going to tell you anything more than that. You'll have to join us in 2 weeks. So everybody, thank you again for joining us, and enjoy your weekend.